Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of this advanced course in yoga philosophy. My name is Sunny Khan and I am your host. In this lecture I am going to be introducing a really important conception for higher practitioners of yoga and other spiritual traditions, and that is the idea of the sphere of influence. I'm going to start the episode by talking briefly about the aura, which is something that most people will have some familiarity with. And then I'm going to talk about why the idea of the aura needs to be expanded into what I refer to as the sphere of influence. At that point, I will end the episode by talking in a bit more depth about the sphere of influence and why a proper awareness of this is so important for practitioners. Most people who have had some kind of clairvoyant sight describe the aura as a field of energy around a person. Many people today talk about the aura as an electromagnetic field, whereas older descriptions of the aura, such as are found in yoga or early theosophy, describe it in terms of subtle influences. Whatever the case, you can be sure that pretty much everyone imagines the aura as a field that exists around their body, and most pictorial representations of the aura also picture it like this. Many people who are sensitive report seeing the aura in this way. They say they perceive the aura as radiant light extending away from the person, a light that may have lots of different colours representing the variety of emotional, feeling, intentional and mental states that a person has. In fact, many early theosophists describe much more within the aura, such as a person's vocation, calling in life and a great deal more. Some sensitive people can read a person's aura like this while they are still in their physical body and are interacting with them in conversation, whereas for other people it occurs when in an altered state of consciousness, such as meditation, trance, or an out-of-body state, such as astral travel. People often spontaneously astral travel when their physical body goes to sleep, but they have no memory of it afterwards, as their astral body is not sufficiently developed. I recall one time when my body was asleep and I spontaneously astral travelled, that I had gone to some meeting place where spiritual teachings were being given. I only had a patchy memory of the journey when I woke up, but it was enough to recall that during this classroom teaching on the astral plane, after it had finished, one of the other students who had been sitting behind me came up to me and remarked how all during the class he was transfixed by my aura and the amazing colours that were shimmering through it. Mainly he described fascinating sparkly shades of high-energy blues, which the early theosophists regard as pertaining to devotion, but also a few other colours. I was surprised and didn't know what to say to him, as mostly I do not perceive this myself, as my own astral sight got damaged by a hostile agent in its early stages of development, and so functions in a different manner. Nonetheless, I remember feeling very flattered and somewhat impressed with myself that I have this dimension of my own being that I do not perceive but which looks so cool. In my physical body in this incarnation, I am fairly ordinary and plain, a middle-aged, bald-headed man, someone that contemporary society regards as rather unexciting, and definitely nothing to marvel at, so it was quite a novelty being something special for a while. Nonetheless, I do regard the level of my own devotion to life on earth and to my yoga as being of an exceptional quality, but it is not given any recognition at all in my current physical incarnation, and that does affront me somewhat. So it was quite nice to see that actually recognised by another person. It's also worth remarking that it is through the aura and the emanations that the aura sends out that spiritual teachers on the astral plane can become aware of an individual who is ready for spiritual instruction. It is worth remembering that when it comes to spiritual development, there can be no deception, no trickery, no shortcuts. Spiritual development will only come when you are authentic and when you have genuinely undertaken a sufficient period of selfless devotion. In the absence of this, your aura will not be giving out the right light or emanations. If you go online today, you'll find that the aura is often described as an electromagnetic field. As the example I gave above shows, this really is a mistake. To limit the aura to this is really not to understand the aura at all. Yes, we do have an electromagnetic field around our body. That is a scientific fact. And yes, that is the physical dimension of our aura, the dimension that interacts with matter. But there is a far more important dimension to the aura that is often overlooked today, and that is the subtle dimension, whereby our own being is really represented in an open and honest way by the colours of our own aura. I have a friend who often says to me, and repeats to herself, "I am all about love, I am all about love." This is an intention she is repeating to herself, and if the intention is true, and not just an affectation for show, then it will be reflected in her aura, as the quality of your intentions is one of the things that shows up really quite strongly in a person's aura. Now, I am not able to perceive the aura in colours, but I can nonetheless perceive the aura, but my perception is more complex and subtle. My astral development has adapted to the damage done in its early stages of growth, and has compensated for this by developing in a new direction. So I can see her aura, and I do see some love and genuine affection, but I also see that she is deceptive. This is not her genuine self speaking, and these mantras are really very mindless, with no grounding in reality. If she was genuine, she would analyse her own actions and realise that something was very wrong, but instead she mindlessly repeats this mantra and blots out anything to the contrary that does not also reinforce this delusion she has of herself, and that includes me. So the aura is not just an electromagnetic field, and the electromagnetic part of the aura is really a very limited part of the aura. Being able to perceive the aura is part of the attainment of direct seeing, one of the attainments of higher yoga. It is called direct seeing because it allows one to perceive aspects of a person's being that our normal senses do not perceive, and which shows us the truth of things. In the example given, I was able to perceive quite clearly that the person was lying when she was telling me she was all about love, and this is the meaning of why this attainment is called direct seeing. But perceiving the aura and other subtle body developments are only one aspect, the lunar aspect of the attainment of direct seeing. There is another aspect, the solar aspect to this attainment, something that I will discuss in a later podcast. So I've given a little overview of the idea of the aura. You can go away and read up on the internet and in books other people's accounts of this phenomenon. As far as I'm aware, it is the early theosophists who brought this concept to the West, along with the concept of the chakras and the subtle bodies that we have, and they brought these notions over from India, where they have been part of yoga for many thousands of years. So we have two separate lineages of instruction here about the aura, one pertaining to the West, which is now perhaps a century and a half old, and one pertaining to the East, and which is thousands of years old, and in which there are many different lineages. Now, I may be wrong. The aura may have a longer tradition in the West that is independent of the East, but even if it does, the identification of the aura with the subtle bodies that we possess and the system of chakras that underpins it does not. This conception has its origins in India and was brought to the West by the early theosophists, and it is this fuller conception of the aura that is central to yoga and to understanding the aura in its fullest dimension. This is the topic I will cover in a future podcast, but I bring it to the attention of the listener now in case you want to go off and learn about it in your own time. You will find, in fact, that it is very difficult to find good instructions on this topic, instructions that are reliable and accurate, and so it is best to cast your net widely, read from many sources, maintain a critical eye, and practice discernment, make good notes, and then compare this with your own experience as your subtle body develops with your spiritual practice. I want now to talk about the non-physical aspect of the aura, which is the really important part to get to grips with. I call the field of influence around the human body, in its physical and non-physical aspect, our sphere of influence. I call it this to distinguish it from the aura. The notion of the aura has been contaminated by the popular discourse from many people who don't really know what they're talking about, much like a noisy background will drown out the voice of a teacher you are trying to hear. And for this reason, I do not use it, as I do not want my own yoga contaminated by the many misguided notions that surround the term. So from now on, I will refer to the aura as the sphere of influence a person has around them, and drop the usage of the word aura altogether. A sphere of influence is a concept that has long roots in physics. We can talk about, for example, the field of influence around a bar magnet. If you take a bar magnet and sprinkle iron filings around it, these iron filings will arrange themselves according to the pattern of magnetic field lines that surround the bar magnet. These magnetic field lines are normally invisible and only become visible when you see the way the iron filings are patterned around the bar magnet. Nobody knows how something that is insubstantial and invisible, like a magnetic field, can affect physical bodies. It is a genuinely inexplicable phenomenon, although the manner in which that influence operates can of course be described in great detail using mathematics. So we can see that surrounding a bar magnet there exists an invisible field of influence. This field of influence does not affect everything. It only affects substances which are referred to as magnetic, such as iron. We can also see that large bodies, such as planets, also have an invisible gravitational field around them. We cannot see this field of influence that surrounds the planets, but we can see how this field influences other objects. So the idea of a field of influence, or a sphere of influence, around a physical body is not something new. Such things have been long described by physics, although they remain fundamentally inexplicable in nature. There is another type of field, however, that is even more inexplicable than these, and these are quantum fields. The quantum field around an object, such as a particle, has very inexplicable properties. The idea of entangled particles is well known and illustrates quite nicely the weird properties of quantum fields. Two particles that are entangled can instantaneously influence each other even though they are great distances away. The nature of their field of influence does not seem to be attenuated by distance, and so the action of that influence can be transmitted over great distances seemingly instantaneously. The quantum eraser experiment also offers us another glimpse into the inexplicable nature of the quantum field, in that it shows us that influences in quantum fields can seemingly travel backwards in time and affect what we perceive as the past. These things are deeply inexplicable and are not properties possessed by the mundane fields such as magnetic or gravitational fields. Nonetheless, when we come to an attempt to understand our own sphere of influence in more detail, we will find that these ideas from physics become essential conceptual tools that enable us to understand the nature of the influences transmitted by and through our own spheres of influence. So let me state now quite categorically that each of us have our own field of influence that extends beyond our body, and that this is what I refer to as our sphere of influence. And let me now describe this sphere of influence and its properties in some detail. That will in fact take up the remainder of this podcast. Firstly, it is important to understand that we have a physical body and we have a subtle body or non-physical body. When the physical body dies, the subtle body does not, and in fact the subtle body can join with another embryonic physical body to form the rebirth of a new life. The sphere of influence that we have around the physical body is electromagnetic in nature, and I will not describe it any further here, as it has been adequately described in many other places. It is the sphere of influence that surrounds our subtle body that I want to elaborate on. Unlike the electromagnetic field, the field of influence that surrounds our subtle body cannot be defined in terms of space and time. For the electromagnetic field, we can say that it extends such and such a distance from the physical body, and we can describe what it is doing at such and such a moment of time. In this way, the electromagnetic field has a well-defined structure that can be easily imagined. The sphere of influence around our subtle body is not like this, but is more like the subtle quantum fields that physicists describe. That is not to say that you cannot envision it as a thing that exists within the confines of space and time, but rather that it is not limited to that description, and possesses properties that are clearly not confined to these dimensions. Let me explain this in more detail. All fields exert an influence on their surroundings, and the nature of the field is generally defined by the types of things the field influences. Magnetic fields influence magnetic substances. Gravitational fields influence substances with mass, and so on. Our sphere of influence also influences other things, but these things relate to biological phenomena, such as mental thoughts, intentions, emotions. Every time we have an emotion, this emotion is transmitted through our sphere of influence. We are taught in the West that our emotions and thoughts do not have any objective existence, but this is a totally incorrect teaching. Our thoughts and our emotions do have an objective existence. They radiate out of us like the way light waves radiate out of a light bulb and spread out into the environment, affecting everything in it. Matter is not an insensible substance. It is also capable of being affected by our thoughts, our intentions and emotional and feeling states. In this way, a given room or environment can come to possess a certain feeling state that may represent the emotional energies that the people and animals that inhabit that space have cumulatively radiated. Of course, there are also many non-corporeal beings, currently not described by biology, who can also have an influence on the feeling tone of a room or environment. Such feeling tones given out by a room or environment can have a radical effect on our own biology, as they are picked up in our sphere of influence and transmitted to us, becoming part of our own emotional and cognitive environment, influencing everything that we do to some degree, greater or smaller. The same is true for our thoughts and intentions, which are also objective objects which have their own existence and do not just exist in our head. They radiate out of us, transmitted through our sphere of influence, and affect the environment around us. In turn, other people who enter that environment will pick up on those thoughts and intentions, as they will be transmitted through their sphere of influence and become part of their own cognitive landscape, affecting everything that they think and do to some degree, greater or smaller, depending upon the effect. The classic demonstration of this is the ghost story, such as the classic haunted house, in which an ethereal vision of a woman in a white flowing dress is seen floating up the stairs. Such experiences are best understood as strong emotional and cognitive effects that have been left on the environment, and which at certain times find a route into our consciousness through our sphere of influence, where we experience them as ghostly visions or noises or some such. There are many more mundane cases, however, and in general, once your sensitivity develops, you will see in fact that everyone is affected by the influences transmitted through the environment in which they live and work, for better or worse, though they are generally unaware of it. Indigenous and land-based peoples are well aware of the various influences that exist within the land. Some places they avoid, due to powerful malevolent influences there. Other places they venerate, due to the presence of powerful benevolent influences. Modern people are generally insensitive to these influences due to their drug-full diets and habits, as well as the nature of the influence of the modern industrialized city. Both of these influences basically numb the body, rendering it insensitive to the environment and unable to perceive these deeper influences and their effect upon them. This is very much to their detriment, as they are no longer able to perceive sinister influences and the effects they are having upon them. This is very much part of the modern condition and the reason for the wayward and destructive nature of modern people. If I experience love for another person, then that emotional energy radiates out of me through my sphere of influence and transmits itself to that other person's sphere of influence instantaneously. That energy will have been imbued with loving intentions, and it will seek to bring to fruition those intentions within the sphere of influence of that person. That may be in the form of good fortune, such as a loving relationship that blossoms, or some much-needed money that comes their way. or it may be experienced in the form of feeling good about themselves, or they may one day find themselves infused with love and feel that the universe loves them. They do not know that it was their neighbour, who they do not like, who sent them those loving vibes, and in the absence of knowing, they are likely to ascribe it to a deity or the universe, or just a general feel-good feeling. Similarly, they do not know that it was a former partner from long ago who, when thinking of them recently, got in touch with their loving feelings towards them and radiated them out, and that it was those loving feelings that resulted in them getting the promotion that they wanted, or in getting the recognition for some work they had done. In this way, you can start to see how many invisible influences there are around us, and which contribute in no small manner for the events of our lives. You can also begin to see the importance of healthy relationships with other people. A loving feeling radiated by another person may linger in our sphere of influence for many years without our being aware of it. If it is a strong feeling that was generated for a significant time, or which is repeatedly generated, then it will act as a blanket around our sphere of influence, shielding us from other harmful influences that others may have generated, or that we have picked up from the environment. A loved one may spend a lot of time wishing and hoping that we find a loving partner. This intentional energy will linger in our sphere of influence and work towards achieving this end. These influences work in mysterious ways, as anyone who is familiar with astrology will know, as these influences are governed in an inexplicable way by the movements of the planets and various celestial bodies. In a state of spiritual ignorance, people will think their loving relationship was a blessing from the goddess Venus, when in fact it was friends and family wishing that they find love that helped bring a loving relationship their way, and that loving influence manifested itself in their life through the transits of the planet Venus. That is, that loving influence remained in their sphere of influence and utilized the transits of Venus in order to bring about the intentions that it was imbued with. This area of life is totally invisible to most people, and this is what in yoga is known as a state of spiritual ignorance. Without the knowledge of matters like these, it is very hard to have any control over the course of your life. People who are envious of you can generate energies that will enter your sphere of influence and literally destroy your good fortune and happiness. This is what the evil eye is. Malevolent, hateful, and murderous intentions can kill you by bringing about physical misfortune, such as an accident. Traditional peoples all know this, and all ascribe an intentionality to life. That is, when something bad or good happens, they seek to understand how this came about, who sent them the bad or good juju that brought this about. When we fall over and have an accident, we think it was just an accident. But in my experience, although accidents can happen, all too often there are more sinister explanations, such as the ill-wishing of someone else, such as a jilted partner, or a business associate we cheated, or somebody we snubbed, or someone whose misfortune we turned a blind eye to. Such energies can linger in our sphere of influence and remain there into our next incarnated life, and enact their misfortune then. These energies are somewhat like bolts of lightning. The potential for a bolt of lightning will build up in the atmosphere, but it won't strike until the right conditions are met. Similarly, the energies in our sphere of influence can build up over the course of our life, or over many lives, but they won't strike until the right conditions have been met. So it is very important to be aware of your sphere of influence, and of the influences that have constellated within it, as there are many means and methods the practitioner can utilize to combat influences that are not wholesome, and to pick up on influences that are wholesome. The whole subject matter of magic and natural magic is full of such methods, but perhaps the best methods that are within reach of everyone are the use of crystals. These have their dangers, however, and I would recommend reading up on these dangers before thinking about using them. I have written a booklet called The Hidden World of Crystals that is available on my website, www.aquarian-age.co.uk, under the Sutras section that I would recommend. There are many practices that we can do to increase our sensitivity to our sphere of influence, and thereby be aware when something malefic has entered our sphere of influence and to manifest harm to us. That is one of the purposes of yoga, and developing the sensitivity of the subtle body, and so I refer the interested listener to my own teachings on yoga, also on my website. So unless we are naturally endowed, our sphere of influence is really only something that we are likely to take seriously when we have developed somewhat in our own spiritual practice, to the point where we can begin to detect these subtle influences. I can generally detect the influences that people generate towards me, even if I have not met or spoken with them in many years. I do not necessarily detect them right away. These influences will linger in my sphere of influence, and during certain transits I will be aware of them, who they came from and why, and I will take measures to ward them off or to work with them if they are benefic, which in my case, sadly, is very rarely. In the current age, people who are spiritual in nature will be on the receiving end of a lot of bad energy from those around them, and their lives will generally be hard as a result. The world we live in is dominated by very bad influences, and these influences will act in a way to bring to bear as much crushing force as they can to wield against anyone who has made any significant spiritual development. In this way, you can rule out every single spiritual teacher or guru who has come to the popular attention as being genuine. They are not. Their genuine spiritual teachers will be unknowns, living blighted lives in isolation and making attainments in obscurity. If you radiate a living influence towards a specific person, that influence will instantly manifest in their sphere of influence, in the same manner in which entangled particles transmit influences instantaneously. In this way, you can see that the sphere of influence is not just a spatial entity, but exists in a dimension in which space and time are much more nebulous entities, somewhat akin to the quantum world described by physics. To give an illustrative example, I once recall doing a magical practice in order to bring home to me all the negative energy I had ever sent out. I felt that now that I was spiritually conscious and much more in control of my mind and its outpourings, that I should take responsibility and remove from the world all the negative energy I had sent out, thereby protecting others from its influence. So I did the ritual, and instantly as I completed it, I could feel a huge wall of hostile energy surrounding me, affecting my thoughts, taking over my mind. It was powerful, too powerful for me to cope with, and so I quickly disbanded the ritual shrine I had constructed and dissipated the magic. As I did so, the spell immediately broke and the energy left. There was no way I could have coped with the negative energy I had sent out, and I conjectured that it was probably best to leave it out there, as that way it is spread out and not targeted at just one person, which is what happened when I did the spell. So you can see that it took no time at all for that energy to return to me once I had recalled it, and no time for it to dissipate once I had broken the spell and cast it back out. These influences are not confined to time and space like normal influences, but operate in a very magical manner, and in this way you can see that our sphere of influence has links both to past and future lives and peoples, linking us in a way that is really far too complex for the mind to fully grasp. I know, for example, that I have received help from a future self in my next life in order to overcome difficulties in this life, and that as a result, in my next life, I will need to do specific practices to generate the energy to send to me now in this life. This is all pretty weird, and reminds me of quantum tunneling, whereby a particle borrows energy from the future in order to overcome an energetic obstacle it is facing now. I am going to stop there in my talk of the sphere of influence. I hope you have found it illuminating, and that you may continue to listen to and learn from these podcasts about the higher philosophy of yoga.